Wait a minute, dude. Your argument doesn't prove a Trinity. Your argument proves perhaps some kind of mental God or some abstraction. Maybe there's like a universal computer, or we're in a simulation, and the simulation includes within its programming transcendental categories. Now, on the surface, this kind of sounds like a good objection, right? It's similar to the argument that we heard earlier that I can come up with a universe that's coherent, and therefore your position doesn't work. But my argument wasn't premised merely on coherence. The argument was premised on coherence and explanatory power and justificatory force. We were saying that was included in what we expect of a worldview or a paradigm. The worldview or the paradigm needs to show that in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, there's coherence, explanatory power, justificatory force. That is the argument. So the claim, well, how do you prove a Trinity, and why not Odin? All right, this is where it gets funny, because you'll get the guys that are like, well, dude, what if I just took every one of your metaphysical things, the grand metaphysical structure of your worldview, and I just stick in Odin, dude? Gotcha. Well, there's a problem with this. First of all, this whole system is not based on abstract speculation. It's based on revelation. We believe and defend what is revealed. What is revealed is the triune God, not Odin. Okay? That's what we're here to defend. So that metaphysical structure that we have as our inheritance from our church fathers, from Maximus, John Damascus, the Cappadocians, all these Christian philosophers who give us our grandiose metaphysic, that happened in history. That comes down as a deposit, part of our paradigm, part of the deposit of our revealed faith, you see. So you can't bastardize, copy, and paste all of that into Odin. It doesn't work. And by the way, as I said earlier, evidential arguments have their place. I can bring in evidential arguments at this point, because I'm going to say my worldview is what's revealed in Scripture. The Old Testament predicts in probably 150 plus places the coming Messiah. It says nothing about Odin, right? Remember, we're not arguing for a mere conceptual scheme, some mindscape. We're arguing for a God who stepped into time and space. We're arguing for the whole Christian paradigm, including the doctrine of creation, including the incarnation and redemption, including the history of the church. That's all part of the paradigm, you see. So at this juncture, it is valid to bring in historical arguments, evidential arguments, right? When I start saying that there's all these prophecies about Christ, that's part of my paradigm. That discounts copy and paste with Odin. And by the way, nobody believes, if you were to literally start, just think how silly this would be. Odin is the second person of the Godhead. Odin stepped into time and space and became incarnate and died 2,000. Nobody believes that. That doesn't work for you. Nobody believes Odin is a ultimate unity and triad reality. No, that's not. So it's obvious that this type of argumentation is purely theoretical and actually just copy and paste bastardizing the Christian metaphysic. So it doesn't work. So you say, why a Trinity? One, because it's revealed. Just simply put, our ultimate circularity and the point where our argument stops is revelation. We can't go any more fundamental, any more meta than that. That's the ultimate meta. That's the ultimate stopping point, the ultimate foundation, the ultimate presupposition, the ultimate precondition is divine revelation. And this relates then to, you have to disprove every worldview. No, I don't. Because this is, again, a mistake. That was the first mistake, right, of not understanding higher order and lower order argumentation. When you confuse those two, that's when you might think, I have to disprove every single worldview. No, all I have to do is disprove, given what my argument is. So don't straw man my argument. If you want to deal with my argument is that every worldview has basic assumptions, in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, you're very limited in the number of steps you can go in each one of those domains. For example, is reality created or uncreated? Right? Is it eternal or does it have a beginning in time? Is knowledge possible or impossible? Is there an external world or not? Are there objective ethics or not? So I can structure a bunch of either ors, and every step that the theoretical opponent takes will determine the rest of that system down the road, down the line, right? So for example, if my opponent says that, as most of these people do, knowledge claims are purely relative, ethics are relative, okay? Those are really strong claims that will determine the rest of that worldview. I mean, that's pretty much a dead end box right there. And that's most people, right? But as you can see, you are actually very limited. There aren't very many. I mean, I could even boil it down to one thing or many things. Is reality ultimately one or many or both? You're limited in those options. And in fact, most religious worldviews out there, most of them, are either monist or dualist. So when we understand that this is actually how worldviews function, that every worldview by necessity can be boiled down to very limited either or starting points. There's not an infinite number of worldviews. The variations in worldviews are down the line. Let's give an example. Most worldviews, as we said, are monist or dualist. If you have basic presuppositions in your metaphysics of monism or dualism, that's going to condition pretty much everything else in the rest of the worldview in a lot of ways, right? For example, everything is one, man. Let's use monism. That's going to condition and necessarily determine the way that I view knowledge claims. I'm not going to turn around and be like, well, everything is one, but I'm a distinct being who has knowledge. No, I'm also part of the one. Right? So monism, pantheism, these are very strong determining forces in the paradigm when we make those kinds of statements, when we have those kinds of views. Now, granted, a lot of people are inconsistent, right? So they're not always going to be consistent. But that has nothing to do with the fact that a person believes, for example, that all reality is one, but I'm a distinct individual. That's inconsistent. That doesn't mean that he actually has a unique worldview. He doesn't. There's countless people who have this goofy, inconsistent worldview. So I could take it in either direction. I could say, well, if everything is one, then you're part of the one and you don't actually know that you are a distinct you. So that's a fundamental contradiction, right? That's pretty obvious right? So there's a limited number of steps that anybody could take. There's not an infinite number of worldviews, literally. You could boil it down to something or nothing, right? Basic metaphysical things, right? Do things exist or not, right? I could just list any number of really easy either ors that will determine where you have to go in your worldview. And every worldview of necessity has some limited number of steps that it can go in any of those basic kinds of questions. It's unavoidable. And literally, that's all I have to do. Now, why is that? Because reality is structured a certain way. For example, everybody will be forced to use basic concepts like unity, duality, multiplicity, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10. There's no other ways that we do and describe things than those types of things. This will lead into our argument later, right? So everything is classed in terms of one thing distinct from other things. That's unity and multiplicity, the one and the many, right? And all of the numerals are classed under one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If we have the Arabic numeral system. 10. Let's take something like the tetractys as an example. When we have this basic numeral system, any type of distinctions or categories that we make of things are going to involve these basic 10 principles. It's unavoidable. Unity, distinction. Distinction requires two, a dyad. A dyad leads to a triad, right? Now you're going to say, yeah, but we don't all accept Pythagoras. We don't all accept that there's a tetractys. I know that there are theoretically other systems and other types of geometry. I know all that. But for human predication, the possibility of human predication, what did we just say in Aristotle and Kant? What do we have? We had unity, universality, particularity, distinction, quantity. Any type of predication of quantity, of unity, distinction, particularity, one and many, must use this type of system. You must use unity, duality, distinction, many. It's unavoidable. 1, 2, 3 are universally basic and necessary. They're unavoidable. There is no possibility of predication that is meaningful that does not use 1, 2, 3. I am distinct from you. 1, 2. When we start building up from that, that's many. 4, 5, 6, 7, a billion. Okay? To say that object is red, that cat is on the mat. The cat is green on the mat. The picking out a specific cat. Cat picking out a specific type of thing that shares in catness. That is singular from a universal, one among many. Number is being brought into this equation. Do you see this? One cat amongst many cats. Unity, distinction, two, dyad. Now, even Far Eastern philosophies, amazingly, were able to pick up on the fact that these universal principles like 1 and 2, unity, dyad, are all pervasive. They underlie language, thought, reality, the natural world. And so, as you could see, you could see why they would come to think that reality itself is some kind of mystical tension of dyad. Hence, yin-yang, right? Opposing forces. Night, day, male, female, black, white, 1, 0. Yeah, yin-yang, constant dialectical tension, push and pull of all reality, right? This is what characterizes all Far Eastern philosophies, okay? Now, and you can see why they would think that, because they're looking at the world, they're looking at these different types of things, numbers even. If you go back to the Bhagavad Gita and this kind of stuff, they're looking at these higher order principles, and they're saying there's ultimate unity and there's ultimate this, that. So they would come up with answers like everything's 1, everything's 2, or it's all just chaos flux, right? There are different types of options you give. You see the Greeks doing the same type of thing. Everything's fire, everything's water, everything's permanence, everything's flux. Oh, it's all just chaos, atoms in motion, right? Atomism, whatever. The point is that all of these descriptors and universal narratives are still utilizing universal categories that require ultimate unity and ultimate distinction, or the principle of distinction itself. That's dyad, you see. This is how we're going to get to Trinity in a minute. But I'm just trying to show you that Anytime we predicate, remember Aristotle's substance, quantity, quality relation? Substance, one thing. Quantity, one thing, maybe two things, three things. Quality, type of thing, relation, next to that thing. This thing next to that thing, relation, two things. And from two, you build up to three and on to everything else. So all numbers are collapsible into 1, 2, and 3, and the first 10. And what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter about other theoretical mathematical systems. I'm not even debating that. I'm just saying that for communication and the preconditions that we mentioned earlier, whether Aristotle's preconditions or Kant's preconditions, some of those preconditions are things like quantity, which require unity and division or distinction or dyad. And from dyad, you get all the others, you see. That's why we're going to make the argument next, which is that Trinity is unique because Trinity, as Maximus will say, surpasses the dyad. What if we just said God's a unity? What if we just said God is a dyad? I'm going to read a few quotes here that I think adequately explain why this doesn't work. First quote comes from the excellent book of Vladimir Lossky, Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. Then we're going to look at Staniloy, and then Maximus, and then the Orthodox philosopher I. M. Andreev, Orthodox Apologetic Theology. So here's the argument that Lossky makes, which I think is good. He says, in the spirit of St. Gregory of Nazianzus, we will speak of his oration on baptism. St. Gregory says, no sooner do I conceive of the unity or the one, when I am illumined by the splendor of the three. No sooner do I distinguish them than I am carried back to the one. When I think of any other than the one, I think of the three. I think of him as the whole, and my eyes are filled, and the greater part of what I am thinking of escapes me. I cannot grasp the greatness of the one so as to attribute a greater greatness than to the three. When I contemplate the three, I see but one torch, and I cannot divide or measure out the undivided light. Our thought must be in continuous motion. This is Lossky. Pursuing now unity, and then pursuing once again threeness, and then returning again to the unity. I must swing ceaselessly between the two poles of the antinomy. Right? One or three. In my human mind and all of our human minds, it's still an antinomy. Keep that in mind, antinomy. In order to attain to the contemplation of the sovereign repose of the threefold monad, however, is what we're after. He says, I'm still stuck always in this antinomy when I'm trying to have the sovereign repose of the threefold monad. How can the antinomy of unity and Trinity be contained in any image? How can the mystery be grasped, say, by the aid of an idea, be it that of movement or of development? St. Gregory Nazianzus' conscious adoption of the language of Plotinus here can delude only those who are unimaginative and pedestrian in their souls, who are incapable of rising above mere rational concepts, those who ransack the church fathers for traces of Platonism or Aristotelianism. Rather, St. Gregory Nazianzus speaks to the philosophers as a philosopher, so that he might win philosophers over to the true contemplation of the triune God. Quote, the monad is set in motion in virtue of its richness. The dyad is surpassed, for the deity is above matter and form. So dyad is usually predicated or universalized from dyads in nature, two-ness, matter, and form. Right? This was typical in St. Gregory Nazianzus' day, is that dyad is a fundamental feature of matter, is what Maximus and Gregory Nazianzus will say. Whether that's the case, that can be debated, but regardless, we'll come back to that later. So he goes on to say, the Godhead does not dwell within bounds, nor does it spread itself indefinitely. The one would be without honor if it were soul and if it were alone, right? If we just had a soul hypostasis, a singular hypostasis God. This would be a holy, quote, Judaic notion. And if we had an ultimate triad or only threeness without unity, we would have Hellenism. Now, remember what we saw in Basil, in the phaser talk. What does Basil say about Aristotle's prime mover argument? Basil says that it necessitates, if you really believe in actus purus, the unactualized actualizer, then God has to eternally actualize and move something outside of itself, Phaser says, namely eternal prime matter in Aristotle's argument. So Basil says actus purus is stupid as a defining character of God because it means that God must have an eternal matter to move. That means that matter is now eternal and takes on a divine character, or property or attribute, namely eternality. Now you have a two-headed God. You have the eternal prime mover and prime matter that's his eternal complement. Now you're a dyad. So you see how easily the eternal monad becomes the eternal dyad. And this is true actually of any of the philosophical systems that might restrict God to a single hypostasis. If he's God and Lord from all eternity, what's he God and Lord over? If he's eternal mover, actus purus from all eternity, what's he eternally actualizing and moving other than himself? Oh, eternal matter, eternal worlds, eternal creation. Really? So now you have a two-headed God. God and the world, the eternal world that he's moving. That's Basil's argument, Hexameron 2. Read it. Read it, Thomists. It's not your view. You don't believe what Basil says. Now, I'm situating this within my larger argument about monad, dyad, triad. I'm just pointing out that very easily a single hypostasis God can collapse into a dyad because he has to have a creation eternal over which he's Lord. For the word God and Lord to be sensible, right? This is partly what Origen argues. But now let's get back to triad, monad, dyad, triad. Losky goes on to say, we gain a glimpse of the mystery of number 3, that the deity is neither one nor many, right? So we're saying that God is not identical to unity or multiplicity. The divine perfection goes beyond the multiplicity of which duality is the root. So here's why we don't believe in a dyad, right? Monad, dyad, this is multiplicity. This is division. This is to move from unity to distinction, right? All number will originate from, as I just said earlier, unity to duality, right? All numbers then extend from that. We recall then that dyadic systems, the interminable dyads of the Gnostics and the Platonists, right? These dualisms are, he's basically saying that they're untenable. All the dualistic systems of the Platonists, same stuff I just showed you in the Aristotelian argument, those are untenable. They're stuck. Thus, we need something that moves beyond the dyad of division and distinction to transcendence and perfect triunity. And Losky says, when we express ourselves in terms of number here, the divinity has no need to manifest its perfection per se to itself or to others. God is the triad, the Trinity, and this fact can be deduced from no principle or explained by any sufficient reason. For there are no principles or causes or sufficient reasons anterior to the Trinity. You hear that, classical theists? Do you hear that, classical foundationalists? Triad is the name which unites and things... Triad. The name which unites things united by nature and never allows those which are inseparable to be scattered by a number which separates, namely by 2. Gregory Nazianzus says, 2 is the number that separates and divides. 3 is the number that transcends separation. The one and the many find themselves gathered and circumscribed ultimately into the Trinity. That's why it can't be an ultimate hypostatic singular God. That's why it can't be a dyad. It has to be transcended in the triad. When I say God, Gregory says, I mean Father, Son, and Spirit. Godhead is neither diffused beyond these so as to be introduced a multiplicity of gods, nor is it yet bounded by a smaller compass than these so as to condemn us for the poverty-stricken conception of deity in monotheism, be it Judaizing or be it Hellenism. St. Gregory of Nazianzus is not seeking to vindicate the Trinity of persons before human reasoning. Rather, human reasoning is grounded in the Trinity. We must ask then whether the idea of number can be applied to God, whether we do not thus submit divinity to some exterior determination or to a form proper to our understanding, such as the number 1 or the number 3. To this objection, St. Basil says, we do not count by addition, passing from one to another to the many to increase, for we do not say that 1, 2, 3, and then we add a third. I am God, the first and the last. He's just saying that God is beyond the created conceptions of numbers and numerics. We are not equating God to the number 1 or to the number 3. Now we have never, even at the present time, heard of a second God. We adore God of God, confessing the individuality of the three hypostases, and we dwell in the monarchy without dividing the theology into fragments. In other words, there is no question here of a material number which serves for calculation and is no wise applicable to the spiritual sphere, where there is no quantity or increase. The threefold number is not, as we commonly understand it, a quantity. God does not possess quantity. When it relates to the indivisibility, indivisibly united divine hypostases, the sum of which is always the unity. 3 is always 1, and 1 is always 3. It expresses the ineffable order within the Godhead. The contemplation of this absolute perfection, this divine plenitude, which is the Trinity, the God who is personal and who is not a single person confined within himself, we see a pale shade of the Trinity. When we consider human relations, this is going to lead us to the next insight, which is from Maximus. Maximus commenting on the exact same section. This is in Questions and Doubts. For writing of this, Gregory of Nazianzus says, this is Maximus commenting on Gregory, the Trinity is perfect. It is the monad having been moved on account of multiplicity, and dyad, which is through matter and form, from which bodies exist, having been transcended, being defined as triune or triad on account of perfection. For it is the first that transcends the composition of the dyad. So, we don't believe that God possesses any composition. We don't believe that God is a pure unity or a dyad. And so the only option is triad. And Maximus comments on Gregory. He says, Gregory does not give us the cause of being of the divine blessed Trinity. So he's not trying to say that this is how God came to be. That is beyond cause and beyond reason. Rather, Gregory is giving us the cause of our being, that we are led by the hand to the most truthful reverence of the triune God. For just as we understand the author of existence from the essence of beings, so also we are mystically taught the mode of existence of the most ineffable divinity from some symbols found in existing things. That is to say, the holy divinity itself moves us into an acknowledgement of itself and provides pious starting points in order for us to have the courage to examine the mode of God's extraordinary existence. And so it is said to be set in motion. So in other words, he's talking about the movement from monad, dyad, triad, right? We're not talking about a temporal movement. the setting in motion is the logical order of how we're understanding 1, 2, 3 in the Trinity. That's all he's saying. It is the cause of our movement in terms of our knowledge of it. It moved itself in us towards the knowledge of him by the things that exist, he's saying. So the monad having been moved and the dyad being transcended is not something that happens in time and space, right? It's outside of time and space. It is said because the divine nature is perceived to exist outside of any composition or outside of any time. And thus, being defined as Trinity on account of perfection, it is said because being itself is not without wisdom and life. Wisdom and life being the Son and the Spirit. God being the Father here identified as being itself, the Son being wisdom, Spirit being life. Understanding that's from the 150 chapters too that Gregory Palamas covers this. Understanding this, we recognize wisdom as the Son and Logos of God, and the Spirit as life. Therefore, our soul, which is created in the image of God, is a little Trinity, is also observed to have nous, Logos, Spirit. Maximus is saying that we see Trinities, little triads in nature. These suggest to us the highest level triad, Father, Son, and Spirit. And he's saying that there's a movement that is of necessity and limited, not a physical movement, but a movement from monad, dyad, transcended by triad. Now, what about, how does this prove our God? How do we know that? 2 more quotes. Next, we're going to move to Stan Eloy. Stan Eloy is going to make a similar point that Andreyev is going to conclude with. This is page 73. In the communication of divine life, St. Cyril of Alexandria attributes a special role to the Holy Spirit. He communicates to human nature, first of all, the power to receive subsistence in the person of the Word, who overcomes the laws of an endlessly repetitive nature. But the spiritual force exists only where there is full communion. The Holy Spirit then communicates to human nature the power to rise again by a new conquest of the laws of nature. The Holy Spirit communicates this spiritual power because he is the Spirit of communion. Full communion exists, moreover, only where duality is overcome. If one person who does not communicate being loses the certitude of existence by being lost within nature, 2 persons likewise risk being submerged in a monotony or in nature through an exhaustive, closed, selfish communion between the 2. Only in the existence of a third person does it make it possible for the maintenance of a continual freshness for each of the 3 persons, as well as for any possible pairing of the persons. It is only in the existence of 3 in the triad that they do not become confused with one another, nor are they totally separated from one another. Only a third person maintains distinctive unity, breadth of love, etc. between 2 persons who can change as partners. Thus the movement that we're talking about, from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, this eternal communal movement, eternal manifestation of the energies, right? The Father eternally loving the Son and the Spirit. It is only in overcoming duality that life is thus truly rich, and in God, infinite and limitless. Christ receives the Spirit as man because as man, he is received into the perfect communion of the triad. So through him, we too might be received into triune communion through grace. Lastly, we will look at Andreyev, the argument that he makes on this same point. He says, even though there are in both the Old and New Testaments general dogmatic truths, nevertheless, the truths of the New Testament are more clear and deeply and spiritually rooted and free from elements that we find in the Old Testament under the veils, right? The symbolism of the Old Testament. So things are made more manifest, more clear in the New Testament. That's all he's saying. Some revealed truths in the Old Testament were expressed more covertly. And some of the more spiritually developed Old Testament people were forced to ponder these things, such as the mystery of the Trinity, which is indicated in the Old Testament. Right? We see the Word and the Spirit mentioned in the Old Testament. He says the Old Testament prophets were revealed. They revealed the Son himself, right? Present-day Hebrew scholars unjustly affirm that the Old Testament had no indications of the Trinity. In fact, the Trinity, as you know, we've discussed it many times, indicates the Trinity in many places. But it is impossible not to see in the Old Testament an undisclosed understanding of the special powers of God, the Word of God and the Spirit of God. The appearance of the triune God to Abraham and the three visitors, etc. Now he's going to talk about strict monotheism. The essential point in the Christian teaching about God is that the revelation of the dogma of the Holy Trinity preserves the inviolability of the Old Testament teaching of God's unity and adds in a special new insight a highly ethical character which was not clear in the Old Testament, nor could it have been present in any other system of monotheism. Then he goes on to say, the blessed Trinity is what is unique here. Strict monotheism witnesses very little to the purity and loftiness and ethical worth of the religion that is preaching it. For you can imagine for yourself some religion of the pre-Christian antiquity, talking about Greek philosophers here, talked about a highest level of unity, a highest being, etc. But it still is inefficient because whether it's Plato or Aristotle, these monotheisms either turn into pantheism, dualism, or barren deism. Only Christianity, through the disclosure of the dogma of the Trinity, has given a solution to the timeless question of the nature of the one God in himself. Only Christianity discloses the truth that God, in his essence one, has definite realities of existence outside of his relationship to the world. All right, this is back to the Aristotle issue. That is, he is tripersonal. And since he is tripersonal in the eternal fullness of his inner life, from all eternity, it is unknown to us, but it exists apart from the world. In other words, God would eternally be in a perfect triune communion, whether he had created the world or not. Therefore, he's not dependent on the world. Not explaining the very essence of the mystery of the Trinity, this essence-energy distinction, the dogma of the Trinity clarifies for our mind something concerning the divine being, namely that there is in the divine being activity that is eternal, that does not depend on the world. The only theology that believes this is the Trinity. And this is literally the only one out there, you see. That's why we're unique. There is in this divine being, in this triad doctrine, an activity unique to our theology that teaches that it is not dependent on the existence of the world. There are conditions for its manifestation, right? Father, Son, and Spirit, in other words. Although an understanding of the triune God is exceptionally difficult, still an understanding of his bare unity is more difficult. In other words, we can't just believe in a single hypostasis. Besides its theoretical meaning, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity has an ethical meaning. Through the mystery of the Trinity, Christianity taught mankind not only to respect God with reverence, but also the doctrine of love, to love God. Through the mystery of the Holy Trinity, a new idea was disclosed, that God himself is love, most lofty and ideal love, an exhaustible fountain of love. Augustine said, the mystery of the Christian Trinity is a mystery of divine love. If you see the Trinity, you see love. The mystery of the Trinity teaches us that divine love was manifested not only in the created order or in the contemplation of the created world, but that it appears in its most perfect, infinite fullness in the very bosom of the divinity. In other words, Father, Son, and Spirit, with the eternal movement and sharing of love, shows that our God, our view, is the only one that doesn't have a necessary created order to reflect it or to have love or to have honor or lordship. Any of the strict monotheistic positions require a world that God lords over or is God of. And the dyad systems don't work. What's your only other option? Triad. He goes on to say, the life of love resided from all eternity in God, the eternal communion of the love of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Thus it can be asserted that the barren monotheism of all the ancient religions, not impregnated by the revealed truth of the Trinity, did not and could not have a true understanding of divine love. And by extension, it leads to a necessary creation, you see. The main distinction between the strict monotheism of contemporary Judaism and the Christian faith consists in the basic doctrine of divine unity and Trinity, right? The divine essence. Only in Christianity, through the revelation of Christ himself, do we understand and know that God is love. And only here do we know what love is. As expressed by Tolstoy, I wouldn't use Tolstoy, but God subordinated all the laws of Moses to the law of love. It was always the law of love, though, so we're going to bypass Tolstoy. To understand this idea of a God of love is impossible. It is impossible in barren monotheism. For whom did God love? Only himself? Only in the mystery of the Trinity does it initiate us into the complete profundity of divine unity. Divine unity being too vast for man's mind, it gives us to understand that divine love was never inactive. There wasn't a point when God didn't love, and then when he created the world, he began to love. Nope, we don't believe that. It never remained without manifestation because of the doctrine of eternal manifestation that's only taught in Orthodoxy, by the way. There was never a pure self-love, but the Father always exteriorly loving the Son, and the Son exteriorly loving the Father and the Spirit, right? And thus pointing to the eternal divine communion of the persons of the Trinity. The complete depth of love of the divinity for the race of man is thus elucidated for us in the light of the most holy Trinity. The mystery is also the foundation of the whole teaching of the Christian doctrine of redemption. So what we see is that we are immediately forced to the doctrine of the Trinity. The Trinity is only taught in Christianity, and that leads us directly to the unique doctrines of Christianity. That's how we get from monad, dyad, triad. Again, there's no other systems that teach this, right? So there's no outs for the speculative atheists and the guys that are, well, what if I said this? What if I came up with this? Right? That doesn't work because those systems don't have any historical grounding. They don't exist. They're copy and paste jobs. You can't just make up a worldview. It doesn't work. But that's how the atheists and these guys think, because they collapse, as Kant did, what God does in our paradigm. They collapse it into the human mind, and thus the futility and stupidity of atheism. So, I think we were on 8 or 9, but that was the big meaty objection of how does it prove triad. So, take all those arguments that I gave an hour ago about universals and how they interlock, combine that with the last hour of what I argued for monad, dyad, triad, and what we just read from all of our theologians, then you get our unique paradigm that ours is the true religion. There you go. A couple other kind of side objections that atheists might pull out. Remember Matt Dillahunty said, preconditions just are. I don't have to justify them. They just are. Again, Matt himself said, and many atheists say, you shouldn't believe in anything unless you have an empirical justification for that. And then Matt turns around and says, I have no empirical justification for preconditions. They just are. Those two things don't work. If I can have an ad hoc rescue, then I can just say, God is. I don't have to prove God. I don't have any arguments for God. God just is. Right? No atheist would allow me to do that. Matt, all of them, they would call me out. You can't do that. That's ad hoc. Dude, you just did that for preconditions. Okay? Therefore, that's not a good argument. It's not a good argument to just say, they just are. Just are what? Preconditions just are. Logic just is. As Father Deacon always says, just is what? What are you talking about? Like, you have a strict view of what you can say does and doesn't exist. Logic just is what? Is matter? Is a particular? Is a mental state? What? What is it? What is it that just is, you see? So we see that this bad argument of, well, preconditions just are. They just are what? They don't have to be justified. Says who? Right? It's you guys who say that you should only believe in things that are empirically demonstrable and justifiable. That's Matt's common, constant refrain. That's why he doesn't believe in God. Then he turns around and says that he has no problem believing in laws of logic and all these things that just are, that are not material, that can't be justified. That is a stupid contradiction. It's very simple. The argument is very simple. You got to be consistent on your paradigm with your own views. There you go.